In 2014, organisers of the Eddington Music Festival to celebrate poet and priest George Herbert wrote, "It is for just a handful of hymn settings of his verse that Herbert is best known, and there will be many to whom his name is entirely unfamiliar. But of the importance of his legacy there can be no doubt, and he is now rightly seen as one of the shining stars in our literary firmament and a significant figure in our nation's history." George Herbert's popular and inspiring Christian hymns, "Let All the World in Every Corner Sing," "Teach Me, My God and King," and "King of Glory, King of Peace," are just three of the poems from his much-admired collection, The Temple. From a young age Herbert wrote religious poetry, and for many students of English literature he is the finest devotional poet, whose work has wide appeal to those both inside and outside the Anglican Church and the Christian faith. George Herbert was born in Montgomery Castle to a distinguished Welsh border family in Montgomery on the 3rd of April 1593. The third Earl of Pembroke, also a Herbert, was a distant cousin. His father, Sir Richard Herbert, died in 1596, leaving his mother Magdalen to bring up 10 children. It's difficult to imagine the poet George Herbert being born here over 500 years ago. It's difficult to imagine anybody living here for a start, it's so ruinous, but also it was a place of strategic importance between the English and the Welsh, built by the English as a stronghold, a place of war and siege, and he's such a gentle poet. After the death of her husband, Magdalen moved the family to Oxford and then to London. In 1609 she married again. Her second husband, Sir John Danvers, was only 5 years older than George. Educated at Westminster School at the age of 16, George won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, which he entered in 1609, intending to offer himself for the priesthood. He excelled in languages and music, and had already started to write poetry. In a letter to his mother in 1610, he declared that, "My poor abilities in poetry shall be all and ever consecrated to God's glory." In 1624, George, following family tradition, became MP for Montgomery, and in the same year was ordained deacon. The centrepiece of St. Nicholas's Parish Church, Montgomery, is the tomb of George Herbert's father, Richard, who died in 1596, and the memorial to his wife Magdalen, who died in 1627, and their 10 children. Magdalen was actually buried in Chelsea Parish Church, and George Herbert at Bemerton in Wiltshire. The memorial was commissioned and paid for by Magdalen. George is the 4th child on the frieze. There is no extant record of George Herbert's baptism, but since he spent the first 4 years of his life in Montgomery Castle, it is likely he was baptised in this font in St. Nicholas's Parish Church. This is Dauncey and Dauncey Manor, where, as Arthur Mee says, a poet came to find a wife. It was in 1628 that George Herbert moved to live in Wiltshire to escape the plague in London. His stepfather's brother, Henry Danvers, lived in Dauncey Manor, a noble house which stands in a choice air. Henry Danvers loved Mr. Herbert so very much that he allowed him such an apartment in it as might best suit with his accommodation and liking. Dauncey Manor is cheek by jowl with the medieval parish church, which Henry Danvers restored and added a tower. Eddington is a day's ride south of Dauncey, and here lived cousins of Henry Danvers. Charles Danvers had 8 unmarried daughters, one of whom was Jane, described as clever and good-looking. And after a very short courtship, she and George Herbert married here in the magnificent church of Eddington on the 5th of March 1629. It is thought that they lived at Jane's family home, Bemerton House, nearby, while George was considering his future. One of George Herbert's poems is entitled The Church Floor, and a visitor to Eddington regarding the pattern of stones in the floors of nave and chancel might wonder whether they gave inspiration to an ardent suitor or nervous bridegroom. Mark you the floor, that square and speckled stone which looks so firm and strong, is patience, and the other, black and grave, wherewith each one is checkered all along, humility. The gentle rising which on either hand leads to the choir above is confidence, but the sweet cement which in one sure band ties the whole frame is love and charity. Hither sometimes sin steals and stains the marble's neat and curious veins, but all is cleansed when the marble weeps. Sometimes death, puffing at the door, blows all the dust about the floor, but while he thinks to spoil the room, he sweeps. Blessed be the architect whose art could build so strong in a weak heart. This is Bemerton, which Arthur Mee describes as a quiet little village which people would come to escape the greatness of Salisbury, and which would have been that case in George Herbert's time. But now it's not a quiet little village, it's a busy suburb of Salisbury, and when you go to the tiny little church, it's like an island with roads either side of it and cars back and forth. In 1629, the parish of Fucklestone-cum-Bemerton, near Wilton in Wiltshire, became vacant. The living was actually within the gift of King Charles I, and when George Herbert's kinsman, the Earl of Pembroke, proposed him for it, the king is said to have replied, "Most willingly to Mr. Herbert, if it be worth his acceptance." The parish was certainly a modest undertaking for a man of Herbert's abilities and background. Of the 200 or so parishioners, the majority would have been country labourers, many of them illiterate. He was instituted in the Little St Andrew's Chapel in Bemerton on the 26th of April, 1630, by Dr. Davenant, Bishop of Salisbury. George Herbert was faced immediately with a church, chapel and rectory, all needing a great deal of rebuilding and restoration, which he did at his own expense. While he and his wife Jane had no children of their own, they adopted his 3 orphaned nieces who lived with them in the rectory. They were generous in their hospitality to both parishioners and strangers, and sought to fashion their family life according to the way of Christ. Twice a day the church bell was tolled as he and his household walked across the lane for morning and evening prayer. And over the rectory is a poem inscribed: "If you chance to find a good house to your mind, and built without your cost, be good to the poor, as God gives you store, and then my labour's not lost." George Herbert's poems were never published during his lifetime. When he knew he was dying of consumption, he gave them to his friend Nicholas Ferrar, directing that they should be burned unless the friend thought them likely to cheer any dejected poor soul. After his death, this bundle of manuscript not only astonished his own people, but gave him a noble place in literature, for his poems are of a high order, and set him for all time among the stars in the firmament of our English poetry. The Flower. How fresh, O Lord, how sweet and clean are thy returns, e'en as the flowers in spring, to which, besides their own demesne, the late past frosts tributes of pleasure bring. Grief melts away like snow in May, as if there were no such cold thing. Who would have thought my shrivelled heart could have recovered greenness? It was gone quite underground, as flowers depart to see their mother root when they have blown, where they together, all the hard weather, dead to the world, keep house unknown. And now in age I bud again, after so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing. O my only light, it cannot be that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. These are thy wonders, Lord of love, to make us see we are but flowers that glide, which when we once can find and prove, thou hast a garden for us where to bide. Who would be more, swelling through store, forfeit their paradise by their pride. The windows. Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is a brittle, crazy glass. Yet in thy temple thou dost him afford this glorious and transcendent place to be a window through thy grace. But when thou dost anneal in glass thy story, making thy life to shine within the holy preachers, then the life and glory more reverent grows, and more doth win, which else shows waterish, bleak and thin. Doctrine and life, colours and light, in one when they combine and mingle, bring a strong regard and awe. But speech alone doth vanish like a flaring thing, and in the ear not conscience ring. George Herbert walked to Salisbury several times a week to attend evensong in the cathedral, and this is the route he would have taken from Bemerton to Salisbury along the river.